was previously slave quarters. And the slave trade took place right outside where the huge cross is, underneath that cross. Unbeknownst to Steve and I, evil spirits were following us while we were there. And Sharon Van, who had traveled with her pipe, had to do spiritual battle every night with awful things trying to get at us from our hotel room. And I think that's really kind of the essence of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with something that's truly ugly to its core. And so the stories that we've heard, the pain, the suffering, the deaths, the terrorizing of our people comes from that place. The invasion of our lands and genocide of our people is based on the doctrine of Christian discovery by order of the Spanish Crown and the Vatican in documents such as the Doom Diverses that we heard some text from yesterday, and the papal bulls. The papal bulls, what they would do is they would incorporate previous text from previous papal bulls and then make an add-on to that. So it would just be a continual flow of previous demands, and then it would be incorporated into the next subsequent papal bull. So all of what you heard about the Doom Diverses as it was written for Africa, that's incorporated into the subsequent papal bulls and carries forward. It's based on a belief that indigenous peoples are uncivilized, barbaric heathens, and therefore the discovering European nation may place itself in a superior position to the indigenous peoples it encounters. Christian colonizers were authorized by the Pope to undertake holy wars of conquest against the heathen and infidel peoples. It is a legal fiction that discovery of the New World by Europeans resulted in inherent limitations on native sovereignty in favor of European discovery nations. We have to understand that the doctrine of Christian discovery is a process that has not ended, and it continues to play itself over and over again, even in our contemporary lives. The invaders claimed a right of possession. They enacted symbolic acts to claim the land. And so I've heard Steve talk about it as they plant a cross, or they throw some grass in the air, or toss some sand in the air, and use that as the symbolism to say that we are now claiming and appropriating this land for ourselves. Luis Rivera, in his book, A Violent Evangelism, calls it a religious act. He explains that these acts of possession were based on the instructions received from the Catholic monarchs, Fernando and Isabel in 1492, to discover and acquire new lands, citing them, saying, "Insofar as you, Christopher Columbus, by our decree, are going to discover and acquire certain islands and mainlands in said ocean sea, the many good and loyal services that you, Don Christopher Columbus, do for us, and we will hope that you will continue to do so, especially that of discovering and bringing under our power, and therefore under our lordship, these islands and mainland." So it was deliberate. It was a deliberate act. And after they claimed that they acquired these new lands, then they would rename the lands. And that was deliberate and purposeful as well. Rivera explains that in the Christian tradition, the sacrament of baptism and the act of renaming are linked. The pagan name was abandoned and a new one was assumed. In Columbus's case, the islands had pagan names. Therefore, they had to be baptized and renamed. The hidden meaning of renaming implies the expropriation, the denial of the authority of Native people to name the lands they inhabit and also to possess it. So it's a denial of the right to name and to possess our own lands. And in this process of discovery and renaming, they claim a profit for themselves. And when I think about it as a process that plays itself over and over again, even in my own work on biopiracy, biocolonialism, you see the process play out in the terms of discovery, where scientists claim they have discovered new genetic material that they can now own through the use of the patent legal system, and then to profit off of it for themselves. So it continues to play itself over and over again. Christian systems of punishment are based on dehumanization, the use of deadly force, and that this force, according to Sands, is an indispensable element for the propagation of civilization in order to create a new Christian state of order. Las Casas, an eyewitness to this cruelty and force, in his book, Devastation of the Indies, writes, "The Spaniards found pleasure in inventing all kinds of odd cruelties, the more cruel the better, in which to spill human blood. They built a long gibbet low enough for the toes to touch the ground and preventing strangling, and hanged 13 natives at a time in honor of Christ our Savior and the 12 apostles. When the Indians were thus still alive and hanging, the Spaniards tested their strength and their blades against them, ripping chests open with one blow and exposing entrails. And there were those who did worse. Straw was wrapped around their torn bodies and they were burned alive. One man caught 2 children about 2 years old, pierced their throats with a dagger, and then hurled them down a precipice." He writes, "There came Spaniards who immediately behaved like ravening wild beasts, wolves, tigers, or lions that had been starved for many days. They laid bets as to who, with one stroke of the sword, could split a man in 2, or could cut off his head or spill out his entrails with a single stroke of the pike. They took infants from their mother's breast, snatching them by the legs and pitched them head first against the crags, or snatched them by the arms and threw them into the rivers, roaring with laughter as the babies fell into the water, saying, 'Boil there, you offspring of the devil.' Other infants they put to the sword along with their mothers and anyone else who happened to be nearby." David Stannard writes, "One favorite sport of the conquistadors was dogging. Traveling as they did with packs of armored wolfhounds and mastiffs that were raised on a diet of human flesh and were trained to disembowel Indians, the Spanish used the dogs to terrorize slaves and to entertain the troops." Historian David Stannard writes in his book, The American Holocaust, that 60 to 80 million indigenous peoples were killed at the hands of the Spaniards in Latin America alone. Historical demographers have been uncovering in region upon region post-Columbian depopulation rates of between 90 to 98%, with such regularity that an overall decline of 95% has been the working rule of thumb. Stannard also talks about the time when the Spaniards came to this land. He says, "The earliest European mariners and explorers in California repeatedly referred to the great numbers of Indians living there. In places where Vizcaino's ships could approach the coast or his men could go ashore, the captain recorded again and again that the land was thickly filled with people. The first few centuries following Spanish entry into the region, by 1845, the Indian population of California had been slashed to 150,000. The Doctrine of Discovery was based on a dehumanized view of non-Christians and was used as justification for their acts of genocide, to dispossess us of our lands, and to institute laws and policies that continue to oppress us today. In one of Steve's articles, he quotes Alvin Toffler from his book, The Third Wave, that says that in every civilization there is a hidden code, that is a repeating pattern. And it's in these codes, in these hidden codes, that seek to normalize what has been established through the colonial domination. These beliefs of racial superiority and Christian domination are embedded in the fabric, in the laws and the policies of the United States. And most importantly, it's embedded in the minds of non-Native people. This is why we continue to see in institutions like this, Western institutional hegemony, that indigenous knowledge systems are less than, that our stories are just myths, whereas scientific knowledge is fact. Peter Derrico, a law professor emeritus at University of Massachusetts in Amherst, in his article, Four Strikes and Johnson v. McIntosh is Out, refers to the case of the 1823 Supreme Court case, Johnson v. McIntosh, in which the Supreme Court made a ruling that diminished indigenous people's right to their land and said that we only had a right of occupancy but not ownership over our own lands. And in his Four Strikes, he says, strike one, the Chief Justice John Marshall had a conflict of interest. He had a personal interest in the land that was being discussed in this case. Strike two, the decision, as reflected in the text of the Supreme Court, is based on religious racism, and it continues to cite justification in the Doctrine of Discovery. Strike three, it was not a real controversy. He says it was a collusive setup, which was set up and designed to answer the question once and for all, who owns all of America? And strike four, indigenous peoples were not even a party to the case. And that violating U.S. Constitution, which says that if you're a party to a case, you have a right to represent your interests and so on. And so these cases, along with Cherokee Nation v. Georgia and Worcester v. Georgia, the so-called Marshall Trilogy, form the basis of what's called federal Indian law, or what Steve likes to call federal anti-Indian law. They're flawed cases. They're based on flawed logic. They're creating a legal fiction that serves as the basis for claiming our land and justifying the acts of genocide against our peoples. The invaders have established colonial systems of domination based on hierarchy and patriarchy that presumes that indigenous peoples are subsumed within that dominant society. The domination and dehumanization of non-white peoples is embedded in the very fabric of American society, in its policies, practices, and laws. The destruction of our economic systems, our governance systems, our right to land, our culture, our languages, our spiritualities, was deliberate and systematic. And it's a result of these laws and policies that have been enacted against us with this ultimate intent. And so it's no wonder that over a period of 100 years, 50% of every Indigenous child that was forced to go to a boarding school died. 50%. One half of those children never came home. And while they were there, they suffered the most horrific documented abuses, from beatings, starvation, sexual assaults, and even electrocution by makeshift electric chairs. They were abused by sadists and criminals who have never been brought to justice. And so we are also experiencing an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls and men. With law enforcement, media, and a justice system that turns a blind eye to any justice for these victims. Our mass movements to protect our lands, such as Idle No More, Standing Rock, the Tar Sands, Kinder Morgan, Mauna Kea, and the list goes on, are unresolved in the face of unbridled greed and consumption. Corporations find their protection in the law. My Maori relatives are fighting to stop state uplifting, in other words, stolen babies, newborn babies from their mothers the minute they are born, under the pretense of safety for the children. Native people have the highest rate per capita of killings by police. Most of the children separated from their parents and their families on this so-called U.S.-Mexican border are Indigenous. Not only Indigenous lives have been in peril since the invasion. On October 30th, 2019, the World Wildlife Fund reported that 60% of the animals with a backbone, fish, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals, were wiped out by human activity from 1970 to 2014. 60%. This is what being and living under domination by colonial rule looks like. So what are we to do? First, we have to decolonize our minds. We have to take a critical look at where we are, where we sit, what we learned, and how that shaped our views and perspectives. We have to question these so-called we have to question these legal fictions that are used to dominate and control our lives, and that attempt to legitimize their brutality and theft by erasure. I'm reminded of the powerful words of Haunani K. Trask in her 1982 speech at Iolani Palace, reminding her people that we are not American. We are not American. We will never be American. We are not Native American. We are not tribal. We are not mission Indians. We are the original free and independent peoples and nations of this land. We must continue to challenge its claims of validity, lest we come to believe it and participate in it ourselves. In the film American Outrage, about the Western Shoshone struggle for land and for their treaty rights, there's a human rights expert at the UN Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and he's saying in the film, he said, there's an old Roman law, he says, that says that where there is an injustice, there must be a remedy in law. So this idea that we can never find justice is a false belief. But the question is, where is the will? Yesterday, Steve mentioned the 7 laws of the Ochete Chacoan, the Wolakota. And we all, as Indigenous peoples, know these 7 laws because they're inherent to us. And we practice them every day. Those laws like respect, compassion, humor. But we live in a system that's based on hierarchy and patriarchy. It's the polar opposite of what we know and how we're instructed to be as human beings. And so we have to remember that we are always going to be in struggle as long as we exist within this patriarchal dominating system. Because that's what it's built on. It's built on principles and beliefs and ways, a worldview that is the absolute opposite of who we are as matrilineal peoples. One of the things Steve said is that we must look at the shore, look from the shore at that ship. We cannot look at the system from the ship. The Haudenosaunee say something similar from their great law of peace. And one of their wampum belts says that we as Indigenous peoples, we need to stay in our canoe. And that the colonizers need to stay in their ship. We don't go to their ship, they don't come to our canoe. And that if we can travel parallel down the river of life, there can be peace. And I find great instruction in those kinds of things. Indigenous peoples need allies who can vision another way to be human, another way to have human relationships that respect not only people, but all living things. Settlers, societies must recognize that the lands, resources, and wealth enjoyed in colonized lands is derived from stolen lands. Our allies must begin with an honest discussion of these realities and work to dismantle these systems of domination. Our work as Indigenous peoples, I loved the presentation that we heard from Kucha last night. She used words like revitalization. She used words like resurgence. We have a lot of work to do. The damage that's been done has fallen on our shoulders to repair, to pick up the spirit of our people, to recover and perpetuate our languages and our knowledge systems. But more importantly, to uncover our true selves, our authentic, original selves, and to disown or discard the colonial beliefs that have been imposed upon us, and to think critically about our futures. Our future generations are depending on us to never abandon our struggle for true liberation and decolonization. Thank you.